some where everyone believed a ledger kept only names, dates, and polite refusals. There was a page that read like a verdict. It names 40 men who turned away, and, at the bottom, one line that was not an ending but a transfer. The colonel's daughter moved from parlor to quarters. Listen, this is not the genteel gossip of drawing rooms. This is the architecture of ruin practiced by men who traded honor for survival. Type, "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If you feel the cold of history prickling the back of your neck, subscribe now and tell us where you're listening from. City, state, country, so this quiet map of witnesses can be seen. I will be your guide into the corridor of shame where private decisions became public crimes. In 1847, on an estate whose oaks made a tunnel you could not pass through without hearing whispers, Colonel Thaddeus Langford returned from war with a scar and a ledger of losses. He had once been a man of standing. He left the war with hollowed eyes and a desperate plan. This is the story of Margaret, his only surviving child, a woman with a mind that could balance ledgers and a body that polite parlors reduced to a whispered problem. She weighed what polite society could not name. Her father resolved to barter her future to stitch together a failing estate, and every man who came to evaluate her became a mirror for the colony's cruelty. Each rejection landed like a legal notice on the colonel's pride, and each one was arranged, encouraged, engineered by forces that wanted his ruin and found their weapon in humiliation. You will hear the ledger's entries as if they chisel truth from bone one by one until the final act is no longer rumor, but a documented collapse. I will not ask you to look away. Stay with me. The more specific your location in the comments, the clearer the web of witnesses becomes, and the more accountable this past is to our present. This opening is a summons. Listen, register, mark the places where this memory surfaces, because the map of such things matters. The parade of suitors continued like a grotesque inspection, men arriving with bowed heads, with candles of civility that guttered when faced with an inconvenient body. Margaret's diary, discovered decades later and hidden away by a society that preferred comfortable silence, recorded the visits with an economy of grief. She described faces, conversations, the polite pretexts and the sudden exits, each one a small ritual of expulsion. But the rejections were not merely the result of personal preference. They were the product of a campaign, a slow poison administered by a rival who wanted Langford's land and would settle for total demolition of his name. Jackson Ruthen, a tobacco factor with networks, orchestrated rumors, placed actors, offered diversions, and turned tender mercies into instruments of mockery. As men turned away, the colonel's mind curdled. Grief and shame made room for a plan that transmuted paternal failure into cold bureaucracy. He found a legal loophole in his wife's trust, and in the winter of his losses imagined a technical transfer that would reclassify his daughter as established elsewhere. To do this, he would use the place already deemed separate by the law and daily practice the enslaved quarters, cabins whose doors had been open to labor, but never to leisure. Imagine the cruelty to place your child among people you own in order to extract from strangers the paperwork that would buy you back from ruin. The quarters are a different grammar of life, communal, compressed, brutal in its necessities. And to send Margaret there was to rewrite her name on a different social ledger. Inside those cabins, Margaret learned the vocabulary of endurance, hauling water before dawn, scrubbing linens until skin split, standing in smoke until lungs recalibrated to pain. But she also learned to read the human economy of the quarters. The way elders taught, how humor survived, how rules became rituals of survival. There are moments when humiliation sharpens into clarity and the mind, despite bruises, learns an unexpected candor. She recorded small resistances, a borrowed teaspoon kept from a kitchen tray, a story exchanged at midnight, a seam patched with thread that carried secrets. Sadie, Ruth and Patience became unlikely cartographers of Margaret's new world, mapping routes between shame and solidarity. The colonel wrote letters to lawyers as if men could convert flesh into ledgers and call it justice. Each visit that left the colonel colder was a small funeral for a different version of himself. The men who came were not a single type. They ranged from cautious widowers to opportunistic merchants, from men who saw duty as a transaction to those who used disdain as entertainment. Every refusal arrived wrapped in a civilized excuse. business complications, sudden illnesses, urgent calls from town, polite pretexts that allowed the colonel to believe in chance rather than conspiracy. Margaret watched the parlor window like a sentinel and recorded the nuances in ink that trembled when it reached for truth. She wrote of a lawyer who praised her intelligence and then cited a distant engagement as a reason to leave. She noted a merchant who laughed too loud and left before dessert, his appetite for mockery larger than his appetite for commitment. Each withdrawal bent the colonel's face into a map of shame. The ledger of refusals accumulated like unpaid debts, and so did the rumors that Ruthen orchestrated. One man was turned at the last minute by a whisper in his ear, another was redirected by a fabricated better offer placed in a sympathetic hand. The orchestration required networks, favors, and the soft violence of persuasion. This was not merely the cruelty of individuals, but a social machine calibrated to humiliate. People in town repeated the barbs as if they were civic announcements. She enjoys her meals. They said she has a robust constitution. They said euphemisms that translated to one verdict: unmarriageable. The colonel's pride cracked along these repetitions. Pride, in him, had been a currency as real as tobacco, and it was spent at every visit. Behind the colonel's decisions lay arithmetic and desperation, a trust that would release only if his daughter was established in appropriate circumstances and creditors knocking louder each week. He chose risk over reckoning, procedure over mercy. Margaret learned that legality could be weaponized into an instrument of erasure. The house that once sheltered her became an apparatus that moved her, as if she were a ledger entry, transferred, recorded, accounted for. That night she packed nothing of substance because the colonel had decided without compassion. She carried only the weight of a history that would now be rewritten in a place where names were often stripped of dignity. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. The walk from the main house to the quarters is a descent measured in small humiliations. It is not the distance that breaks someone. It is the manner in which each step is witnessed and unremarked by those who once promised protection. Margaret walked under oak branches that once had been a cathedral of pride and felt them press like fingers at her shoulders. House staff watched through windows, hands over mouths, eyes like dark coins that would not meet hers. The two field hands who escorted her kept their distance, as if proximity might contaminate them with whatever the colonel had decided. Inside the cabins the air was a palimpsest of soot, damp, and the smell of old labor. Sadi, with a back bowed by decades of service, pointed to a corner and said, "Simply, this is yours. There are no ceremonies for such expulsions, only arrangements, straw for bedding, borrowed vessels, a curt exchange of clothes." Patience and Ruth, who had watched the colonel's decisions in silence for years, moved as if obeying an ancient rhythm, their gestures practical and unromantic. Margaret felt a cold she did not recognize at first, not the weather but the sudden absence of entitlement. Tasks came at dawn: haul water, tend the hearth, scrub until knuckles blistered. The work is physical, relentless, indifferent to status. On the third day, when she collapsed beside a wash kettle, Ruth knelt beside her and offered a technique to wring sheets with less damage to the hands. It was an act of instruction, not pity. In the quarters, Margaret discovered a surprising ecology of care. There were elders who remembered names the house had forgotten, children whose laughter ripped through sorrow like light through slatted blinds, women who patched wounds without looking for reward. The colonel's plan to make a legal fiction out of his daughter's removal failed to account for human reciprocity. Margaret traded silk for rough cotton, but found language where there had been none: stories of escapes, recipes for stew that no kitchens in the main house claimed as theirs, lullabies that had been sung under breath for generations. Yet the sting of betrayal did not soften. Each night she wrote in a stolen moment. The diary pages are tethered to a person that the plantation's logic attempted to reclassify. In her writing she clarified the small resistances that kept her whole: a spoon hidden at the back of a drawer, a smuggled scrap of paper, the rhythm of a shared joke. These were the tiny rebellions that meant survival. They were not enough to erase the law, but they documented what law tried to deny: that when people are forced into corners, They still fashion ways to live. Watch the arithmetic of ruined ledgers, trust clauses, and cold signatures can rearrange lives more cleanly than brute force, and men like the colonel learned that paperwork could be a blade. He drafted letters to lawyers in Richmond with a steadiness that belied his moral collapse, describing an establishment for Margaret that he intended to define in terms that suited his immediate need. The trust held his late wife's dowry with a condition that surviving children be established in appropriate circumstances, and he harnessed that phrase like a legal fulcrum. He imagined judges and clerks as neutral instruments who would rubber stamp his fiction if presented with the right documents. He was not entirely wrong. Bureaucracies have a way of accepting appearances as facts. The colonel believed he could convert his daughter's existence into a line item that would clear accounts and buy back the plantation's future. He did not reckon with the moral gravity he had traded for solvency. For Margaret, each new petition forwarded by the colonel was a betrayal rendered in ink. She had never been a calculation on paper, she had been a presence in rooms, a reader of ledgers who could reconcile numbers as deftly as she could mix pigments for her paintings. Yet, to the colonel, she had become raw material. The quarters taught her another kind of arithmetic, how to divide portions so that a family could eat, how to measure coal and water and time so that everyone survived another day. There the sums were about survival, not property. Sadie taught her to count in the language of labor. How many buckets before the sun crossed the oak? How many scrubs before the linens were clean enough to be returned to the house? How many small kindnesses before a person could call another friend? This pedagogy of endurance created a new intelligence in Margaret, one honed by necessity. She began to see the colonel's letters for what they were, attempts to hide sacrifice behind legalese. In the evenings, by a small oil lamp, she wrote a ledger of a different kind, a list of names of those who had given her a blanket, a bowl of soup, a secret smile. These names mattered. They were not entries to be traded. They were the architecture of reciprocity that the house's law could not quantify. Rumors had made Margaret a spectacle in parlors and markets, but in the quarters she became an exercise in reconstruction. Her body was read differently here. It was measured by capacity to last through repetition, by the body's memory of labor rather than its conformity to fashion. She moved in ways that had been foreign, bending at the waist until the spine ached, using hips to turn washboards, learning to carry weight without complaint. There is a language to such motion that cannot be learned in drawing rooms. It is taught by watching hands that have been at the same task for decades, by attending to rhythm, tempo, and the economy of breath. Margaret absorbed these lessons quickly because her mind had been trained by numbers and systems. She learned to turn labor into a cadence that could be sustained. The quarter's social order was strict, but different respect was earned through work and knowledge, not inherited by name. Children watched her with a mixture of curiosity and an almost hostile expectation. Elders measured her with a patience that wanted to see whether grief would calcify into bitterness or become the grit that shapes empathy. There were moments of humiliation, a child taunting her about silk in the mud, a field hand refusing to offer a hand when she slipped. There were also moments of grace, a shared piece of bread warmed at an ember, a soft voice reminding her of the correct way to stoke the fire, a laugh that acknowledged the absurdity of human pretense. In private, Margaret sketched in charcoal the faces of those who had looked at her without disgust, and these drawings became a secret gallery that taught her that dignity could be reclaimed in fragments. Meanwhile, the colonel pursued his legal aim with the calm of a man who believed a document could absolve his conscience. He celebrated what he called a pragmatic victory when clerks accepted his affidavits and when the first installments of the trust were hinted to be released. The money, he thought, would restore the plantation and perhaps his standing. He did not foresee the slow moral erosion that would follow. The way neighbors would learn that a man could sacrifice his child to save his name and then look to him for counsel on honor. In the quarters, gossip traveled differently. It was not a weapon wielded by the powerful, but a community's way of cataloging wrongs and teaching younger ones to avoid them. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. The colonel's legal maneuvering rippled outward like concentric circles in a pond, touching people who did not know Margaret and did not want to know her, but who felt the tremor of scandal. Creditors recalibrated their threats, neighbors adjusted their social skirts, and Ruthen smiled as each twist tightened his grip on Langford's fortunes. He had not merely wanted land, he had wanted a narrative of ruin that would make Langford's name a cautionary tale in Richmond's salons. That narrative required spectacle, and spectacle required a protagonist. Margaret was transformed into the perfect tragic figure, a woman whose body became the public ledger of a man's failure. Her diary, where she wrote with exquisite cruelty to herself, captured the psychic geometry of being made into a symbol. She recorded not only the rejections, but the way they landed like small legalistic hammers on her self-worth. She noted how the colonel's greetings became shorter, his touches colder, until one morning he announced in a voice like an auctioneer's that she would be moved to the quarters. The house staff spilled out to watch, and the field hands fell silent at the sight of her walking down the oak-lined path with those two men who escorted her like courthouse officers. When she reached the cabin, Sadi told her plainly that this was no temporary lesson. That was when Margaret felt the full weight of abandonment. This abandonment was not dramatic, it was procedural. It was the kind of cruelty that passes through hands without a single shout. People in the quarters tended to such wounds daily, and so they met Margaret in a way that combined practical instruction with a blunt compassion. They set her up on a narrow pallet, gave her coarse clothing, and taught her the first week's chores. They also, quietly, taught her how to preserve a private identity when the public one had been stolen. In a world where names could be transferred like property, the quarters held names like relics, kept safe, spoken softly, remembered. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. The quarters' rhythms became Margaret's new calendar: sun up, water hall, scrub, steady fires, men tend the children, sleep and rise. Each repetition shaped her body and mind in ways the drawing room never could. She learned the unglamorous arithmetic of the hearth: how many embers to keep alive for cooking, how many coals to spare for a neighbor, how many small gestures would keep communal ties from fraying. The women taught her remedy songs for blisters and ways to soften colices with oil. Men recited practical proverbs about pacing work through the heat and the rain. In these small, interlocking practices, Margaret found a slow education that civilization had never offered her. It was not the education of books, but of weather and muscle and mutual aid. She began to see her father differently, not only as the man who had arranged introductions that led to rejection, but as a figure who had surrendered to panic and allowed law to become a blunt instrument. In the main house, the colonel believed he had secured salvation when the first tranche of trust funds was acknowledged as releasable. In the quarters, these same events were reported in fragments and rumors. An envelope here, a quiet visitor there. That money would not erase faces that would not meet Margaret's. It would only consolidate a version of respectability that depended upon her erasure. Ruthen, watching from his vantage, tightened his smile. Scandal had become precedent, and precedent had become currency. Yet the quarters had its own forms of currency: favors, loyalty, the shared knowledge that survival depends on reciprocity. Margaret began to trade not in dowries but in usefulness. She learned to mend shirts with economy, to fetch water in ways that conserved strength, to soothe a child with a lullaby that belonged to a woman who had lost her own children decades earlier. The quarters taught her that agency can be fashioned in small acts. It can be secreted away inside a spoon, inside a stitch, inside the steady cadence of a workday. And as she gained competence, she gained a different kind of esteem. Not the brittle esteem of polite society, but the durable esteem of those who know what it takes to stay alive. The colonel's creditors were practical people who measured time in interest and in the color of ledgers. As the trust release inched closer, men in Richmond discussed the Langford case as if it were an abstract problem. Could a child's establishment truly be manufactured to satisfy legal conditions? Lawyers debated wording and precedent, while the colonel paced in his study and believed relief was near. He did not hear the conversations in the quarters, where Margaret and others catalogued a different set of realities. There, the question was not how to satisfy a clause, but how to live under its consequences. Children asked awkward questions about why Miss Margaret no longer ate at the house, and why a poor woman like Sadie had authority over her. Margaret answered as best she could, refusing to dramatize the cruelty but not hiding it either. She told them she had been sent to learn, and to help she minimized the humiliation into a duty she could fulfill. This act of reframing was not denial so much as a strategy, one that allowed her to keep dignity while accepting the work she needed to do to stay alive. Yet she kept a private ledger, names and small acts of kindness, and these lists were a way of asserting that a life reduced in one ledger could still be richly accounted for in another. Outside the plantation, gossip did not quiet. People in nearby towns toyed with the notion that the colonel had acted for the good of the family, that hard choices were part of patriarchal duty. In parlors they offered moral calculus that excused his behavior because it promised stability. But in the quarters, the calculus was different. What had been done was not charity but dispossession. And in that reframing, voices hardened into a quiet insistence that such an act be remembered for what it was. Sadie, with her ancient hands, told Margaret that history often prefers to wash its hands and calls certain things unfortunate. She instructed her to write down names and events to keep a record. Memory, she said, is a weapon if you know how to use it. Margaret took the advice seriously. She began to write not only for herself but for others who might need a voice later. Her entries shifted, becoming less dreamy and more forensic, a catalogue of injustices with small notes on who had offered aid and who had turned away. This practice of documentation was itself a form of resistance, one that no clerk could easily dismiss. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. The plantation's ordinary violence is often invisible to those who profit, because it is normalized into schedules and ledgers. The colonel believed he was performing an act of preservation. He rationalized his choice as necessary sacrifice. But sacrifice implies consent and reciprocity, and in this case there was neither. Margaret had not chosen exile, she had been consigned to it. The quarters provided a brutal curriculum in realism. She learned to interpret the signals that governed punishment and reward the overseer's glance that promised retribution, the mistress's silence that meant complicity, the way laughter could protect or humiliate. She also learned to see the ways the system sustained itself: whispers traded like currency, fear enforced compliance, and small mercies were negotiated undercover. Yet amid this brutality, solidarity formed. A woman named Ruth, who had been on the plantation for years and who once had a small child stolen by sale, spoke to Margaret with a tenderness that was born of loss. Ruth said plainly that the colonel's acts were not exceptional but part of a pattern, that the plantation's economy required constant replenishment and that human lives were the raw material. "They'll tell you it was for the family," she told Margaret. "But families don't sell daughters like cattle and call it love." That sentence haunted Margaret because it expressed the moral clarity she lacked under the colonel's rhetoric. She began to understand the broader matrix. Ruthen's manipulations had supplied the leverage, the colonel's desperation had provided motive, and the social code of the region had provided cover. Together they produced a cruelty that could be documented on paper and then explained away by people who had never had to sleep on straw. Margaret's private ledger grew more precise. She recorded dates, names, phrases used by men in the parlor, and even the expressions on their faces. Her writing evolved into evidence, not legal evidence perhaps, but moral testimony. And that testimony, when whispered to the right ears decades later, would become a different kind of weapon, one that exposes the machinery of shame. The quarters had its own archive of memory songs stitched into hems, recipes whispered in the dark, the exact way a child's fever rose on the third day. Margaret absorbed these, and in doing so, she reconstructed herself from the debris of a life rewritten. She learned not only labor, but the ethics that governed small communities under duress. Reciprocity, there was not a polite custom, but a survival imperative. You share water, someone watches your child, a neighbor holds your hand when you cry. In this matrix, Margaret found mentors who taught her the names for injuries and the cures for the body and for the spirit. An elderly man named Amos, who had been on the plantation since before the colonel's father was born, spoke often of memory. He told stories about places beyond the county and about times when people had organized quietly to reclaim small freedoms. He did not romanticize, he spoke pragmatically about networks, signals, and the way to pass messages. These tales were not fantasies but maps. From Amos, Margaret learned that survival could be strategic and that pain, if documented and passed forward, could become a caution. Meanwhile, the colonel lived in a house that had fewer comforts than before. The money he expected from the trust would not, as he had imagined, restore a simple golden normalcy. Creditors tightened terms, neighbors watched for signs of weakness, and Ruthen pressed his advantage, buying up parcels and consolidating holdings. The colonel's reputational currency wavered. Men who had once nodded with respect now included him in conversations that assumed his failure. He began to drink more, and letters to lawyers became more frequent and more urgent. Yet even as the colonel scrambled to hold on to what remained, Margaret's private work of testimony continued. She wrote lists, not to indict only her father, but to record a pattern of social complicity: who had laughed, who had stood silent, who had quietly offered an extra loaf of bread. In the act of recording, she reclaimed agency. Names that had been used to justify her removal were now repurposed. They became the inventory of those who bore witness, whether as perpetrators or as the quiet containments of mercy. A curious thing about time on plantations is how events that seem discreet to the powerful are in fact tightly braided for everyone else. A lawsuit here, a rumor there, a carriage on the lane. These were the threads of a shared fabric. For Margaret, the months in the quarters were a series of small reckonings. She discovered that humiliation could be reframed into discipline, that discipline could become skill, and skill could become a means of exchange. She mended clothing so well that house workers began to request her hands. She learned to mix dyes and to patch holes with near invisibility. She learned the precise angle to tilt a pan so the fat would separate most cleanly. These practical competencies were not glamorous, but they bought her something rarely available in her old world: respect, based on competence rather than pedigree. The quarters, paradoxically, offered a kind of dignity that polite society withheld. People there judged one another less by inheritance than by the way one held a family through a storm. Sadie, who had been the quarter's moral fulcrum, nodded with approval when Margaret offered a suggestion on how to rearrange the water station to prevent spills. That nod was worth more than any curt bow she'd once received in a drawing room. But dignity in the quarters coexisted with ongoing pain. Margaret could not fully escape the knowledge of being used as a legal instrument in her father's quest. She still scribbled in her diary late at night, cataloguing the colonel's letters, noting signatures, dates, and the phrases used to justify her removal. When she heard footsteps at the cabin door, she would pause her pen and tuck the pages away, not yet ready to make her writing public. The quarters taught her caution as much as it taught resilience. At the same time, a slow cultural shift was occurring outside. Ruthen's campaign, which had once relied on mockery, now leaned on precedent. If men accepted the colonel's maneuver as law, they could replicate it elsewhere. That possibility made the quiet acts of documentation inside the cabin more urgent. Margaret's lists could, in a future she could barely imagine, be summoned as testimony against a system that normalized such transfers. The ethics of memory had become for her a tool, a way to hold accountable not just individuals but institutions that permitted the conversion of persons into property. People who profit from systems rarely account for the small, accumulating indignities those systems inflict. Instead, they look at totals and decide whether the harvest was sufficient. The colonel measured losses in acres and in pound tobacco. He did not factor in the moral depreciation that accompanied selling off dignity. He believed that once the trust funds were released and debts cleared, social life would resume and the curious pockets of gossip would dissolve into polite forgetfulness. He miscalculated. Money can pay debts, but it cannot mend the public narrative that resulted from choosing expedience over paternal care. Langford's neighbors began to talk, and not always to excuse him. Some expressed unease in muted ways. averted eyes in market aisles, and unwillingness to accept invitations from the main house. Others, however, sought to rationalize, to assert that hard choices were part of sustaining family estates. It was this social split that made Margaret's testimony complicated. She could expect both indignation and rationalization. In the quarters, she watched the slow work of memory turn inward. The women kept lists of who had done what to whom and for what price. Men catalogued transactions and favors that had any bearing on future safety. These were not simply gossip, they were a community's ledger of accountability. Margaret's diary evolved from private lament to a record shaped by communal truth-telling. She interpolated others' memories into her pages, cross-referencing dates, and noting when someone had offered a contradictory account. This practice made her record more than a grief, it made it a document of multiple witnesses. At night, she compared notes with Sadie and Ruth, refining details, making sure that what they would eventually say, if they ever had to speak, would be coherent. This process hardened her resolve to ensure that her story could not be reduced to a single anecdote of personal shame. It would be, instead, an archive of injury and survival. Meanwhile, the colonel's mental state frayed further. Strokes of paranoia and regret alternated with moments of brittle satisfaction when a clerk's reply suggested the trust was near release. But satisfaction was always brief. Money, when it arrived, did not return the domestic rituals that had been stripped from his house. It only made public the calculation he had made. The quarters operated by a logic that ran counter to the plantation's official logic, where the house measured value by pedigree and wealth. The quarters measured value by reciprocity and endurance. Margaret learned to navigate both. She kept her diary close, but she also kept careful accounts of social debts. Who had shared bread, who had watched a sleeping child, who had offered a shoulder. These were not the kind of debts a court could enforce, but they formed a robust social network that protected its members from total collapse. As she learned, she also began to teach. Younger girls watched her arrange water stations and fold linens. Older men asked for news of appointments and letters. She became a conduit between the quarters and the house in small, unexpected ways. Sometimes she ran errands for Sadie into the main house, slipping quietly through spaces that had once been her exclusive domain. She noticed details there that others might miss: a ledger misfiled, a clerk's handwriting that betrayed haste, a visitor's coin too bright for his station. These observations would later clarify chains of influence related to Ruthan's schemes. Margaret's double vision, seeing both the quarters and the manor, became an asset, but it also deepened her sorrow. She began to understand how systems normalize the extraordinary, how cruelty can be repackaged as necessity. Watching the colonel correspond with lawyers, she saw his manner change from pleading to justification. Where once he had seemed haunted by pride, he now sought rationalization. He wrote letters that read like legalistic prayers, petitions seeking confirmation that in transferring his daughter, he had acted within acceptable bounds. War had taught him how to follow orders. Debt taught him how to make laws serve immediate ends. The men who exchanged favors with Ruthan were practical about consequence. They considered what precedent might mean for future property disputes. If a child's status could be shifted via paperwork, then social hierarchies could be rearranged more rapidly than anyone expected. For Margaret, the danger of precedent was personal. She could be a case study rather than a person. This awareness pushed her to be meticulous in her records and in the stories she collected. Each entry in her diary was an arrow aimed at the future, hoping that memory might one day pierce retribution's armor. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. In late autumn, when the tobacco fields lay brown and exhausted, the colonel received word that the trust might finally be settled. He paced with a fevered determination, imagining a moral ledger balanced and a future reconstructed. He could not see that the moral ledger had been rewritten by his act. Where he had expected gratitude, he would find suspicion. Where he had anticipated relief, he would find a residue of shame. The quarters, conversely, braced for winter the way every year demanded by conserving, by sharing, by saving small portions of food and fuel. Margaret took part in these preparations with a competence that surprised even herself. She organized wood stacks, taught a more efficient method of drying linens to avoid mildew, and arranged sleeping rotations to keep the little ones warm. Her authority in the quarters rose quietly. She was not a leader by pedigree but by utility. This shift changed how the quarters regarded her. She was no longer solely the colonel's daughter, but a member valuable for her contributions. Yet this new standing did not erase the trauma of her removal. She still woke at night imagining the parlor's windows like eyes that had judged her and turned away. To cope, she collected small proofs of human decency, a bowl left at her door, a whispered apology from a man who had once laughed. She stored these in her diary as evidence that the world held more than cruelty. Outside, the legal wheels ground forward. Clerks asked for more documentation. Lawyers negotiated language with the patience of men who knew how to make instruments obey. Ruthen watched the process and calculated future gains. The colonel celebrated each small victory as if he had bought forgiveness. He did not see that the community's moral ledger had recorded his choice differently. In parlors, debates about propriety and necessity rose like a fog that obscured truth. The colonel's defenders claimed that his desperate act had preserved an estate that supported many lives. His detractors argued that a child's rights had been traded for property. Those latter voices were quieter but persistent. In the quarters, Sadie reminded Margaret that names must be kept and stories told. Memory, Sadie said, is the seed of justice. Margaret continued to write, understanding that her pages might one day be the only proof that such things had been done in the name of necessity. Winter hardened the ground and sharpened the edges of small cruelties. The colonel had, by then, secured enough assurances to feel the weight lift slightly from his chest. He spent evenings by the hearth with a drink and the rustle of paper, letters from lawyers, receipts, and a formal acknowledgement that the trust would be dispersed on terms he found acceptable. The money promised respite, but it also confirmed his earlier calculus that a family could be preserved through one member's sacrifice. He could not imagine how the world would remember him. For Margaret, the season demanded ingenuity. Food shortages required creativity in the kitchen. Clothing had to be repaired meticulously to last through the cold. She and Ruth experimented with layering to maximize warmth, using thin cottons under heavier fabrics in ways that trapped air and insulated bodies. The younger children learned games that required no toys. They invented songs that turned monotony into something tolerable. Margaret began to teach the girls to read in small, secret lessons by lamplight. Her education, once the ornament of her life, now became its tool. Literacy was a small form of power in the quarters, a way to document and to plan. As she taught, she felt a quiet pleasure, not the giddy delight of being noticed by polite society, but the sober satisfaction of equipping others with means to survive and to remember. Meanwhile, dealings outside the plantation took a darker turn. Ruthen's purchases had consolidated enough influence that men in the county began to see him as a stabilizing force. He brokered agreements and positioned himself as a benefactor to those who feared economic instability. This consolidation made it more difficult for those seeking justice to operate. Power coalesced where money flowed. The colonel, secure in his belief that money would heal the wound, could not fathom that money also smoothed over the moral contours that once made questions harder to ignore. In small gatherings at the manor, men toasted to survival, to practical choices, and to the future. They rarely spoke Margaret's name in these conversations. When they did, it was a word dropped like an inconvenience. But in the quarters, her name was spoken with the force of memory, and that dissonance became a quiet engine for what would follow. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. The county social map began to change subtly as Ruthen accrued influence. Men who once measured themselves by lineage found themselves weighing new alliances. The colonel, now less panicked but still morally compromised, moved through these shifts with a mixture of relief and disorientation. He had paid a price that no ledger could capture, and yet he accepted the resolution as if it were a clean transaction. Margaret, by contrast, felt the consequences persist like a bruise that would not fade. She continued to teach and to document, but there were moments when the memory of the parlor's sneers returned with vivid clarity. In those nights she wrote not only with grief but with an emerging clarity about culpability. Her diary began to identify names and motives, to reconstruct timelines, and to connect Ruthan's whispers with specific rejections. She cross-referenced events with other witnesses in the quarters, creating a networked account that would later have the power of corroboration. This meticulousness was an act of defiance. It insisted that the truth be more than a rumor. The quarters, for all its scarcity, had a moral logic that required accuracy in testimony. False accusations could doom people, honesty could protect them. Margaret embraced this ethic. She interviewed elders, she recorded where payments had been rumored to be made, she noted when a visitor lingered too long in the parlor and whose influence seemed to carry. This work consumed her nights, and slowly it began to coalesce into a potential record that could not be dismissed as mere bitterness. Outside, men continued to rationalize the colonel's choices. Some argued that his actions had preserved livelihoods and prevented a cascade of sales. Others whispered that the ends never justified the means, and that the precedent set could be dangerous for anyone with something to lose. The debate swirled, but in the quarters, the focus remained on memory and on the small acts of resistance that kept people human. Margaret's growing archive had an odd power. It made private injury legible. She organized pages by date, by visitor, by phrase used when a man left, and by any inconsistency that suggested orchestration. Sadie taught her to fold letters in a way that would preserve them from damp, and to stash them where a searcher might not glance. When Ruth came to her in whispers, with a rumor about a new demonstration of disdain in the parlor, Margaret recorded it, noting the faces and the tone. The act of documenting created a rhythm of accountability that was both practical and spiritual. It required care, precision, and the willingness to confront a truth that many preferred to ignore. This practice drew the attention of a few sympathetic outsiders, a county clerk's aide who occasionally passed a legal note in quieter tones, and a distant cousin who, upon hearing fragments, pressed for more details. These minor ports of contact were like breath into a slow fire. They kept possibilities alive, but with each recorded detail there was also danger. To name Ruthan, to link him to a campaign of humiliation, was to invite retribution. The quarters had its ways of assessing risk. Some acts needed to be public, others private. Margaret learned which to share and which to hold close. Meanwhile, the colonel's newfound financial stability did not translate into personal peace. He visited the quarters less frequently than before, and when he did, his eyes slid away as if looking at the place where one's conscience might reside. He asked for reports of work, bits of business intelligence, and the occasional slender comfort that money could buy. He did not ask for forgiveness, and he did not offer apology. The gulf between his transactions and Margaret's daily life widened into an unbridgeable distance. Yet even as that distance grew, small alliances formed that would later matter. Amos, Sadie, and a few others began to whisper about the necessity of preserving testimony for when there might be an audience willing to listen. Their conversations were practical: how to ensure documents survived, how to train a few trustworthy readers, how to make memory into proof. These plans were cautious, tactical measures against a future that might bring reckoning. The months accumulated and Margaret's record swelled. She had transcribed phrases, remembered faces, and cross-checked timelines. The act of writing had become a ritual that sustained her interior life and also functioned as a communal ledger for those willing to bear witness. She made copies where she could, taught Ruth to transcribe certain entries in case her own pages were seized, and enlisted a few trusted neighbors who agreed to keep sealed envelopes in barns outside the plantation. This network of archives was modest but durable. It ensured that the story would not dissolve with the first wind of denial. Meanwhile, social forces outside the plantation shifted in ways that were hard to predict. Economic consolidations had a domino effect. Ruthan's growing holdings guaranteed him more influence in local politics. The colonel's temporary relief became a permanent rearrangement of power. There were men in town who quietly profited from stabilizing the Langford estate under new terms, and these men preferred to keep the past inconveniently silent. Yet silence can never be absolute. People who know things speak in time, especially as generations turn and new actors arrive with less invested interest in preserving comfortable pretexts. Margaret's archive, kept small and protected, waited for such a time. Inside the quarters she continued work and teaching, turning daily tasks into structures of endurance. She also kept her spirit alive through Small Beauty's charcoal sketches, a short poem about oak leaves, a watercolor of the well. These were not frivolities but anchors, reminders that a life subjected to cruelty could still produce art and meaning. They also functioned as proofs of personhood in a world that often reduced some people to property. These artifacts, alongside her ledger, compounded the moral evidence that would one day compel attention. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If this unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Your location matters in a story about communal memory. Years passed in ways both slow and sudden. The trust funds were partially released, accounts were settled, and yet the Connell found no true restoration. Reputation once cracked refracts light oddly. It never returns to its original sheen. Ruthen consolidated holdings and recast himself as a stabilizing force in the county, leveraging the very scandal he had helped to create. But power built on humiliation always contains a weak seam. In small ways, a court clerk's offhand confirmation, a cousin's returned letter. The fabric of that power began to fray. Margaret's ledger, kept in secret and handed to trusted hands beyond the plantation, began to surface in the years that followed. Her careful documentation, the corroborated notes from Sadie, Ruth, Patience, and Amos, and a few external witnesses who had been unwilling to keep silence combined into a dossier that could not easily be dismissed as private grievance. The county's memory slowly shifted. Conversations that had once excused the Connell's actions began to carry questions about precedent and morality. People asked whether legal language could be used to sanctify cruelty, and whether communities that permitted such acts were complicit. Margaret, who had been forced from parlor to quarters, watched this change with a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. She had not sought public reckoning for her own sake. She had sought that truth be acknowledged so the pattern might be altered. In the end, the ledger that had once been used to measure her rejection became, through her own painstaking work, a tool of accountability. The irony is bitter. A document can both wound and heal, depending on who holds it. Margaret's story, preserved in pages and in memory, became more than a personal tragedy. It became an argument about how communities remember, what they preserve, and who they allow themselves to forget. If you have listened and felt something shift in you, tell us where you are. Add your voice to the map of witnesses, because memory, when multiplied, becomes impossible to ignore. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal it and bind this truth to the living present.